So like most of you said, that the reason why you're taking this course is you want to learn more about sort of test creation. And the reality is people spend a lot of time sort of focusing on stats. We require students to take classes like 100A, 100B, which is on, statistics and research methodology. But sort of test creation and those things are not really required for most students, which is fine. Not everyone's going to go into test creation, but I think it's actually good because a few of you said you want to go into the clinical psychology. And it's actually, most clinical psychology relies on psychological tests for things like diagnosis or looking at personality traits and how those relate to other things, especially trying to figure out treatment for somebody. So even if you're not going to create tests yourself, at some point you're going to use them, and you're going to rely on what they say about the clients that you're serving. And so it's good to know the sort of how to know if a test is sort of good or bad, and how to decide for yourself if you should use that test or not. So so the questions you'll encounter as we go through this. So like, what is a psychological test? I'm sure you've taken them in some form or another. Even the sort of silly ones online where you like, click here to find out what, Harry Potter house you're in or whatever, right? So even those to some degree can be sort of seen as psychological tests. They're trying to assess your, personality traits by different things you click on or whatever. Now the validity of those, I'm not going to guess they're probably not super valid, but, because I don't know, it's based on a fictional characters. I don't know, but there's all kinds of those where it tell you like, hey, if you click on these few pictures, we'll tell you about your personality and what kind of things. So some of those may actually be valid tests. I have no clue, but all the different kinds of psych tests, and then there's all kinds of different kinds of psych tests, and we'll talk about those. For what purposes are they used? And again, they're used for lots of different reasons, a few of which are not necessarily all that great. They're not necessarily all that positive. Have psych tests ever been used on me? Yeah, they probably have. You've probably taken some psychological test or another. And even to a certain degree, the aptitude test that you've likely taken in grade school, in middle and high school, those to some degree are testing sort of aptitude, which is very similar to lots of things. So you've definitely taken some. And then the big things we'll spend a lot of time is how do we know if a test is reliable, is it valid? And then of course we're going to be talking about statistics again. For some of you, maybe for the first time, or at least maybe not in a while, but we'll talk about statistics again just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So beyond just the test, because a lot of times people think about the test as a whole, is the test valid, is it reliable? All right, well, what about the items itself? How do we know if items are good or bad? And that's where we get to this item analysis stuff, where we look at difficulty and discrimination of items. What kinds of things affect your response? So is the testing situation actually affecting your response, depending on where you take a test or how you take it? It can actually affect how you respond to an exam or to a psychological test. The answer is of course. There's all kinds of things that can affect the way you do it. I had a colleague of mine just looking at voter behavior and where people voted, and how people vote actually was influenced by where they voted. And by that may sound strange, but if for instance, if your polling place is located in a church versus in a community rec center, all the religious iconography and stuff in the church may actually affect the way that you respond to questions, even at the polls. So all kinds of things can affect the way that you respond to things. And then, because we're talking about testing, we'll spend some time talking about intelligence testing and sort of how those things were developed and what intelligence really means and how you can really interpret those things. So like, what is an IQ anyway? And does IQ really measure intelligence, and does it measure it well? And then a big question too, should schools really care about my SAT scores, my GRE scores, my LSATs, my MCATs? And do these things really actually predict the success I'll have going into a graduate program or into undergraduate to begin with? And whether or not you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, do these things really, really matter? And we're seeing more and more, as you've probably noticed, that things like the GRE are being required less and less by graduate programs because they're figuring out that they really don't predict things very well. And there's an issue with that. Like for instance, with the SATs, and this is off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly, but the SATs predict the success that you'll have in your first semester of undergraduate. Beyond that, it doesn't do very well at all in terms of predicting anything. But yet we make everyone take it, and places like ETS have a crazy monopoly on making everyone take their tests and using them to sort of figure out things like admissions to college. So I think you're gonna see more and more universities sort of moving away, and the COVID-19, the current pandemic, actually is interesting because it's pushed that issue even further. So now all of a sudden, universities before were like, oh no, we're still going to require the SATs. We're like, during the pandemic, we'll waive the SATs for the incoming freshmen next semester. And I think they're going to see that not much has changed. There's not much difference, and you'll likely start to see SATs going more and more away at different colleges, different universities. Again, stop me if you have questions or comments on things. This could be more sort of discussion oriented, since it's it's a pretty small group of you. So some of the things too, like we'll talk a little bit about projective tests, which are interesting, like the Rorschach test, which is weird coincidence, because I just started watching the Watchmen show, which is on HBO, I think. I'm watching it through Hulu, so I think it's HBO. And like the bad guy in its name is Rorschach, and he has actually a Rorschach mask on. Anyway, so the Rorschach, the original sort of Rorschach test, which is called a projective test, where you look at these sort of ink blots, you're supposed to decide, you're like, oh, what do you see in these ink blots? It's supposed to, every like movie where you have someone being sort of, being admitted into a hospital or tested to see if they're crazy or not, they always break out the ink blots and ask, like, what do you see in these pictures? And it's been sort of almost equated synonymously with psychology and psych testing, is these projective tests using these ink blots. So we'll talk about those and the sort of reality of how well those actually do at predicting things. And what about, like, just a regular psychological test where you answer a bunch of questions? So can you actually figure out if someone has a psychopathology based on just answering a bunch of true-false tests? Like have you ever heard of the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which gets used a lot to sort of diagnose people with schizophrenia or depression or all kinds of different disorders, depending on how they respond to a bunch of questions. And it comes down to, especially this is aimed somewhat at the folks that on here that want to go into any kind of clinical application. Look, all I want to do is help folks and help people get better. Why do I need to submit them to all these sort of torturous tests? And I don't mean literally torturous, but I mean that's oftentimes they're long. Like the MMPI is like, it's like 365 or something. No, that's not right. I think I'm just saying, like, that's the number of days in the year. It's like 360. It's a whole lot of questions. Like 400 questions. It takes like 3 hours. It's a crazy long test to have someone go through. Yet it's used all the time. There's all kinds of other diagnostic tests too, but and the reality is, like, you're looking for ways to try to objectively test if someone really has an issue or not, because it's likely you can't just ask them, because they may not even know themselves, right? So we got to figure out ways to sort of get around people's biases and people's reluctance to admit things and be able to diagnose things without all that stuff getting in the way. All right. Okay, so this is where sort of psychological testing comes in. Now, you may or may not have heard the term psychometrics before, but that's what the term psychometrics is. Literally means psychological measurement. It's a field of study concerned with the theory and technique of educational and psychological measurement. I took that straight off of Wikipedia. So when I got my PhD from UCLA in the psych department. And when I was there, the program was called Measurement and Psychometrics, which I always thought was funny because it's completely redundant. It's called Measurement and Psychological Measurement was the name of the program. So Measurement and Psychometrics. It could have just been called Psychometrics. But the issue I always had is when somebody asked me, "Oh, what are you getting your PhD in?" I would say Psychometrics. They would say, "What's that? What the hell is psychometrics?" But if I said psychology, they assumed I meant clinical. So I was always in this weird, sort of gray area in between there. So I would just say, "Oh, I'm just in quantitative psych," which is what the program eventually changed its name to. So now UCLA has a quantitative psychology program, but it is essentially still focused on measurement and psychometrics. I'm surprised that this class isn't offered more often as a regular course. Because when I mentioned, so a little bit of background. Again, so I used in the past since like 2007. I've been teaching in the summer at UCLA because I'm actually I'm now a full professor at Cal State Northridge. And because I graduated there and I knew some of the folks there, they asked me if I'd teach in the summer. So I have every summer since 2007. This particular summer, they decided to go a different direction with their 100A course, or they're doing a whole thing with R and a bunch of other stuff. And because they're going that way, they had specific people they wanted to teach the course. So they offered me another course. Like, hey, you want to teach something else? I'm like, well, like what? So I went back and forth with them and we came up with the idea of doing this psych testing course, because they don't typically offer an undergraduate psychological testing course, at least not that I know of. That's why it's actually listed under 188B instead of it being its own course. It's offered under what they call experimental courses. So it's like whenever they want to try out a new course or try out a new topic, they put it under this 188B number. So they don't have to go through the process of creating a new course, which can sometimes take up to a couple of years to actually get it on the books and into a catalog or into a place, like into the schedule of courses. Anyway, that was a lot of information to say. So that's why I'm teaching this course instead of doing 100A. So I taught this course before at CSUN, and I'm supposed to teach it again in the spring of this next year. So I thought, all right, this would be a good class to teach and to try out there and see if students like it. Anyway, that's probably why you may not have heard anything about this course, not a whole lot of information about it other than the catalog, because it's really the first time it's being offered, at least at the undergrad level. In the grad program, there's like Psych 255, I think is their measurement class, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time. But there is classes in the graduate level on measurement theory, just not the undergraduate level. Anyway. So the program exists, and there are lots of faculty there. So this is something you find interesting, you want to go more into. You definitely find faculty there that are in that area, and you get more experience with it. So this is, psychometrics covers a lot of things, and it really covers even educational testing, which oftentimes people don't really assume is a part of psychological testing. They think psych testing and sort of aptitude or educational testing are separate, but it's all the same stuff. So measurement of knowledge, abilities, attitudes, personality traits, and it involves sort of two major tasks, sort of making the test, like construction of instruments, and then testing and refinement and further sort of development of those approaches to sort of make tests better. All right. So the thing about psychology that makes it interesting is oftentimes the whole point is psychology, we're trying to either describe distributions or relationships among these very abstract concepts. So the things that drive people crazy, but even though in educational testing, people talk about aptitude, which is also sort of this very vague, abstract term. We talk about all kinds of stuff. We measure things like political conservatism or intelligence, neuroticism, aggression, and you name it. We try to measure it in psychology, and they're all things that we can't test directly. We can't just go out and measure them directly. So we have to figure out ways to measure political conservatism. And a lot of times in courses like 100B, when you talk about how you define your variables in a research study, it'll be like, oh, you need an operational definition, right? So if I want to know if someone is more or less politically conservative, we need to operationally define that some way. So you can say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how politically conservative are you? And have someone just sort of, circle the number. But oftentimes people have difficulty even articulating how conservative they actually are. And so you need to ask it in more subtle ways. So this class is about how do you develop tests where there are multiple items that cover different aspects of a concept like political conservatism, and that it sort of combines them together to give you a sort of a scale or a score along a scale from conservative to liberal or something like that. And the same thing goes with intelligence. There's not really one type of intelligence. There are multiple types, multiple sort of things that people are intelligent in. So how do we actually measure that in some cohesive, holistic way when there's so many different aspects to it? And the same thing goes for personality traits like neuroticism or things like aggression, which the other thing to keep in mind too is as we develop tests, you want them to be utilized by everybody who who takes the test. So if someone takes the test and they score a certain amount on say aggression, we want that aggression score to mean the same thing. The problem is it oftentimes does not. So there are biases in tests sometimes that we have to sort of look out for too. So for instance, how are men aggressive? Like, how do men show aggression? Just give me an example. Okay, yelling. What else? So what kinds of things, if there was a male in front of you doing things that you thought were aggressive, what would those things be? So yelling would be one, sure. Like their hands waving around, being sort of threatening. All right. What else? Yeah, like going up and punching somebody or kicking them or doing all kind, whatever. Those are very aggressive types of things. They're usually very physically aggressive. Now, how are women aggressive? Okay, so there's definitely something that coincides, the yelling and stuff. And women can actually be physically aggressive. I'm not saying they can't be. It's just they typically will be aggressive in different ways that men don't. And I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be sexist or anything. There's a lot of overlap, and these are all generalities. But what ways are women aggressive that men typically don't do? Yes, like relational aggression. Exactly. Men don't say, I'm not going to be your friend anymore if you don't do X, Y, and Z or whatever. Use the relationship again. I mean, they do maybe, but not nearly as much as women do. Women will tend to, to take out their aggressions on people by using the relationship against them. For instance, you won't find a whole lot of men making fake Facebook accounts to ridicule and make fun of people that they don't like, or something like that. That's not a typical male thing. They'll just go and punch them, right? There's the whole aggression is can come out in very different ways depending on things. So again, these are all super overly generalized, but the idea is that there are different kinds of aggression displayed. So if you create an aggression scale that only focuses on physical aggression, you're probably not going to be surprised that men score higher on aggression than women. But if you flip that around and make the scale about relational aggression, again, you can't be surprised that women will score higher than men. So you have to take into account sort of the ways in which these things manifest themselves in the populations you're measuring, and try to find a way to sort of do that. Sometimes can be difficult, if not impossible. All right. So everything in psychological research, I don't care what it is, everything that we do that has to do with research requires this sort of process here. So constructs that we try to measure are all abstract. And I had a professor when I was at UCLA who called it ghost chasing. We're always chasing ghosts. We're chasing these sort of things that don't exist, right? Everything that we study, just most everything we study in psychology, are abstract, metaphysical, intangible things. They're ghosts that we're always chasing. And the way that we actually try to prove that they exist is really similar to the ways in which, if you watch those ghost chaser, ghost hunter shows on Discovery Channel or whatever the channel they're on, we're always trying to find evidence, right? They say, oh look, the temperature changes here, there's electromagnetic waves there, there's sounds, there EMF, what is it called? The electro voice phenomenon, EVF, whatever it's called, where they capture it sounds like people talking over sort of frequencies and things. All these things, they try to gather little pieces of evidence that collectively looks like the evidence that ghosts exist. We do the same thing. We try to find mostly behavioral things that occur that people are doing that give us some signs that things sort of exist, that these sort of ghosts actually exist within the person. So this process is called sort of operationalization, or it's, assigning an operational definition. So think about something like intelligence. Most everyone knows what intelligence is. You ask someone, what does it mean to be intelligent? They'll give you some sort of idea, but it's a very complicated thing. And most of what we know about intelligence comes from our experience with people who we think are intelligent. We meet someone like, oh my God, that guy seems really smart, that girl seems really intelligent. And we start to put together this idea of what intelligence looks like and what intelligence should look like. And we're even told too, like, we take those, for me, it was like the STAR testing, but it probably was still, for many of you, if you were at least in California, the STAR, I forgot what it stands for, but now it's sort of switched to the SBAC, which is sort of the newer sort of aptitude testing they do, or achievement testing they do in the public schools and things. If you scored high on those, that give you this sort of idea that you were intelligent. So we started associating intelligence with abilities and our ability to sort of score high or low on these kinds of aptitude or achievement tests. So we have some concept of what intelligence is, and intelligence, we agree, we all believe that it exists. Intelligence is a thing that exists. But in order to measure it, in order to actually look at it, to be able to study it, we have to operationalize it in some way. So we need some kind of measure or some kind of construct, construction of a measure of intelligence, which oftentimes we use this idea of an intelligence quotient. So your IQ is a measure of your intelligence. They're not the same thing, but we use the intelligence quotient to try to get an idea of how intelligent somebody is. So this is a construct, an operational definition that is meant to try to measure this unmeasurable thing up here that is intelligence. And that process is this operationalization. Now, I could operationalize this in lots of ways. I could just go up to everyone that knows a person. So let's say if I'm picking on, I'm going to say it wrong again, Nija? Nija. I'm saying it horribly wrong. Yeah. Okay. At least I'm not calling you nice. I knew it wasn't that. Okay, so Nija. That's close, probably the closest I'm going to get to it, to be honest. Yeah. So I remember I had all through high school and into to college, I dated a girl that was from Hungary, and she was always trying to get me to say words in Hungarian. I got in trouble a lot because I would say a word, and then because I didn't pronounce it quite right, it would mean something else. I once tried to say a blessing at dinner for her family. That I'd be all cool and say it in Hungarian, and then what I said was not that. It was really bad. It was supposed to be like to your health or something, and then because I pronounced one of the letters wrong, it was like to your whole butt or something. Like it was really goofy. It didn't make any sense. And everyone laughed. And I'm like, why is everyone laughing? And so she had to explain it to me afterwards. Anyway, so if you're not used to a lot of the sounds, you don't hear them. I would not hear the differences between them. Even back in high school, I had already, grown too accustomed to sort of the sounds in English to really hear a lot of differences. Anyway, that was a weird digression. So, someone would ask me, "Hey, you're going to talk about your high school girlfriend during lecture today?" I would have been like, "Nah, there's no way." Anyway, so I started to pick on Nija there because let's say if I want to know if she is intelligent, I could. One way of operationalize that, I just ask her, "Hey, how intelligent are you?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm a 10. Okay, cool. So she's intelligent based on her own admission, right? I could also go and talk to everyone that she knows and have them rate her intelligence, and then take some kind of average level of their rating of her intelligence. So there's different ways we can operationalize things, and as you can tell, they're going to be better or worse, right? At least how valid or reliable they are is going to depend a lot on how exactly we operationalize what intelligence is. We tend to go a different route with intelligence. There's all kinds of intelligence scales. There's the Stanford-Binet, which is one of the sort of original ones. But it was highly dependent on language. So someone it was almost impossible to test someone's intelligence without them having a high level understanding of the language. So to give you an example, if someone is a native Spanish speaker, they've learned very little English, and you test them in English, they're going to come off as being less intelligent because it requires a lot of understanding of language. So there's a lot of ties for intelligence and language that come to the Stanford Binet. So other measures like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale started to use non-verbal tests. These are like puzzles and things people could do that didn't require language as a way of measuring intelligence and to sort of disaggregate the measures of intelligence from people's understanding of language, right? So there's different approaches to how things are done. We typically don't ask someone as a measure of intelligence, hey, how smart are you? That's not typically how we do it, because that's not going to be very reliable. Everyone is going to rate themselves more intelligent than they actually are, especially in the United States. So there's actually U.S. respondents typically overestimate their abilities. I mean, it's crazy. It's like if you ask someone how good a driver you are you a good driver, right? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, are you a good driver? It's something like 80% of respondents rate themselves better than average. So think about that for a second. That's actually impossible, right? Because more or less half the people are going to be above average and half are going to be below, but yet 80% say that they're above average. So there's a tendency to sort of for people to overrate their abilities relative to other people. And there's actually there's something to say that people who underrate their abilities, there's likely a psychological issue like anxiety or depression there as an indicator of that. So there's a whole other conversation. So it's like a protective mechanism that we tend to overemphasize our abilities somewhat, oversell ourselves. Anyway, so most of everything that's in, how many of you took 100B at UCLA? Yeah, so it looks like, at least 3 of you that I can see all took it. But, okay, and Liana too. So, Jessica, Sienna, probably Yvette too, I'm not sure. But the idea is that you spent the whole 100B course learning how to design an experiment and how to identify your independent, dependent variables and all those kinds of things. That whole process was trying to find the dependent variable. You had to sort of operationalize what you were actually measuring, what you're going to do. Typically, we did it in 100B, which is a single item, something very, like reaction time or some simple sort of scale that we use to measure something. And what we're talking about in here is just our operationalization of things is going to get more complicated. But yet that's going to mean it's going to cover more things. It's going to be more useful. It's more flexible that way too. All right. So the value of scientific research is completely dependent upon the degree to which the operationalizations are successful or valid. So when we talk about the term valid, is a scale valid? What we're asking is our operationalization of that thing, does it really match the actual concept? So does IQ, the operationalization of intelligence, how well that corresponds to the actual concept is what makes the scale more or less valid. So we'll talk more about that later, but it's just the idea of how good a job did you do at operationalizing your measure. That's really gonna be the factor that's gonna tell you whether or not you have a valid scale or not. All right. So just some quick, just language things. Concept, right, is this very vague thing. I got this out of a dictionary some years ago, and I always thought it was the worst definition because I read the definition of concept and then I understood less what it meant after I read it than before. So concept is an abstraction formed by generalization from particulars. I remember I had to read that multiple times, and it still didn't make any sense. So after a while, I sort of figured it out. These things are not abstracts; they're abstract, and they're hard to define. And something like intelligence. So I mentioned before, oftentimes the way that we understand intelligence is by experiencing people we think are intelligent, or by doing something and having somebody else tell you that you're intelligent. So there's these experiences we have. Those are these sort of particular experiences we have And then from those, we start to generalize back to an abstract sort of idea. Right? So we witness events, we witness things sort of happen, and then we start to make a generalized sort of an idea of what that thing is, and that's what a concept is. So anything, I mean, things like love, freedom. I mean, you mentioned whatever the sort of concept is. Not only did we sort of learn what it is by sort of experiencing things that told us what it is, but it also explains why, depending on who you ask, you can get very different answers to what is intelligence, what is, whatever the concept is. It's going to be, you're going to get very different answers. And if you ask a very young child, they're going to be very simplistic answers. And if you ask as people get older, their answers become a lot more complex because they've had more experiences, more particular events. Therefore, their abstract concept becomes a lot more complicated. Where, on the other hand, a construct is something that's been constructed, something that's been sort of designed, is a functional concept. It's a concept that has some kind of scientific purpose. So as soon as we take a concept and we apply an operational definition to it, it becomes a construct. Make sense? So a construct is a concept with an operationalized or an operational definition. Something that can be measured, it can be studied. And IQ, because there's so much time spent on trying to develop measures of IQ, it's actually a really good example because it's been developed in so many different ways, and there's been so much work done on sort of developing measures, constructs of intelligence, that we're all very used to this idea of an intelligence quotient or an IQ. I often will use that as an example. It's a really good sort of construct that measures a very abstract concept like intelligence, very complicated concept like intelligence. I didn't give myself enough room in this one. All right, over the side. What you can't see is like I'm literally right. There's a light. It's right here. Literally, like my face is like right next to this light. So like I'm straddling the leg on the light and trying to squeeze in here. Sorry. Okay. So variables and constants, right? So variables change, constants don't. Variables vary, constants do not. But what's important to note here is that a variable and a constant can be one and the same. The same variable in one context can be a constant in another context depending on how it's used. So they're not absolute differences. It's not like everything is a constant all the time and a variable is a variable all the time. If I do a study and I use men and women in the study as participants, then sex, gender is a variable, right? It has at least two, arguably more values than just one. But if I use only men, then sex gender is a constant in that particular study, right? So depending on how the variable or constant is used, it could be a variable, it could be a constant depending on the context. So people's age, the temperature, intelligence, xenophobia, these are all different things that can be seen as variables if they're allowed to vary. If people can have different ages, people are allowed to be in rooms with different temperatures or whatever it is, you're picking people of different intelligence. But as soon as you select people of all the same intelligence now becomes a constant. Okay. And we oftentimes will do things like that, like we'll hold things constant so that we can see the impacts of other variables. So if I want to know how, xenophobia, I don't know, how xenophobia affects people's, so maybe I look at how does intelligence affect xenophobia? Does anybody know what xenophobia is, by the way? I should probably mention that. Do we know what's xenophobia? You're close. It's because it's a phobia, right? It's a fear of foreigners or fear of outsiders or fear of, I think the technical term is sort of fear of outsiders or fear of something, but it's been used to look at people who have fear of foreign people, like sort of invading or coming into their country. So oftentimes it's an interesting idea because especially in the current climate, there is a lot of xenophobia that's sort of fueling a lot of the sort of political things going on from lots of different places. I mean, lots of different areas. Whether you're talking about the pandemic or you're talking about the current sort of administration. I mean, all kinds of stuff. There's lots and lots of xenophobia. It's just an interesting term. And I think the term too, the term phobia gets misused a lot. Like, I mean, not to be sort of, not to be out there, but like when people talk about homophobia, most people that are homophobic aren't afraid of homosexuals. So the term phobia gets sort of misused there. They just think that it's like it's wrong, or I don't know why they use the term phobia there, but the idea, even xenophobia, it's oftentimes not fear of, but it is like discrimination against people who are from a foreign country or something like that. So let's say I want to know if intelligence predicts xenophobia. If I want to know if intelligence predicts xenophobia, I probably should control for other things, like education, right? So because maybe it's not how intelligent somebody is, but how much education, how much they've learned, been exposed to that predicts it. So I probably want to make sure I use all college graduates and see if there's a variation in intelligence that predicts xenophobia. I may want to pick people of a similar age, because maybe it's not that intelligence that only predicts xenophobia, but maybe as you get older, you become more xenophobic or less xenophobic or whatever. So I probably wanted to control for and have people of a similar age when looking at whether or not intelligence predicts xenophobia. So oftentimes we make things constant so that other things can vary and we can see what their impact is on the outcome. Right? So variable versus constant really depends on the context and what it is we're trying to show predicts what and how they relate to one another. All right. We got the independent and dependent variables, which people oftentimes get confused, but in like a regression sense, the independent variable is the predictor, the dependent variable is the outcome, or the thing that's being predicted. This is probably the easiest way to think about it, because regardless of whether or not, because you'll hear people say things like, oh, in experiments, IVs are the cause because they're the things that we manipulate. Yeah, that's great, but what if you're not in an experiment? Then that doesn't really work. So it really just comes down to the sort of the order. If I think that X here, right, is influencing Y in some way, and the direction is going that way, the arrow, then X here is the independent variable, Y is the dependent variable. And the reason why Y is dependent is because based on what we're assuming here, Y is dependent on the influence of X. And X isn't dependent on anything. Nothing's predicting X. Therefore, this is free to, to predict Y all it wants. So just think about this sort of order of influence. As soon as the arrow goes back the other direction, if I say that way instead, then I've now made Y the independent variable and X the dependent variable. Well, it just depends on the order of influence. And of course, if it's going both directions, if I think this way, it's like how people oftentimes signify correlation, it's by a double-headed arrow. Then I'm saying there is no independent variable and dependent variable. They're just two variables that relate to each other. Okay? So it really has to do with what you believe is the order of influence. The thing that is doing the influencing is the independent variable, and the thing that's being influenced is the dependent variable. Questions about that? I've had colleagues that are instructors, like professors that are researchers, that oftentimes will get these confused still. So it's that's not because this is sort of overly simplistic, but oftentimes because with many variables going on at the same time, you can start to lose the thread somewhat. I'll give you an example. So I don't mean to make my colleagues out like they don't know what they're doing. It comes down to this. So let's say I have an X variable, and it predicts a Z variable, which in turn predicts a Y variable. So now it becomes interesting because what's independent, what's dependent, all that stuff. Anything that's got an arrow coming to it like this is dependent. All right, so this is technically a DV, but this also is a DV, and this is the IV. So it becomes it can become complicated depending on how many things you have in a model and how many things are predicting each other. This is technically This is technically called a mediator, or sometimes an indirect. That this is an indirect prediction. So the z variable is mediating between x and y. So there are more than just IVs and DVs. You have IVs and DVs. You also have other things like mediators. There are also things called moderators. So there's more to it than, you know, like in your 100B courses and stuff, we tend to say, oh, there's IVs and DVs. Well, yeah, but there's also other things too. Right? Questions so far? All right. I probably should keep track of what time it is too, because I'll literally get talking and like lose all track of time. So, okay. So another thing to keep in mind too is this idea of discrete versus continuous variables. Discrete variables, discrete versus continuous, it just means, discrete means that you have a very finite set of values. It's restricted only to certain numbers. It can take on any whole value. So if you look at it like a digital clock, as the minute changes, you know that the minute changed, but anything in between there you don't know. You know, there's a whole minute changing. You know, things like number of children per family, number of students taking 100A, those oftentimes, you'll see goofy things like number of children per family. I remember it's like the average family has 2.5 kids. I'm thinking 2.5. That's a very strange, like, how do you have a half a kid? But, you know, those really are just sort of whole number discrete things. And another thing to think about this too is this line looks like, if you listen to sort of digital music, like MP3s, for instance, are discrete in the sense of you're getting chunks of information that actually have spaces in between, and your brain is able to interpret it as sort of continuous sound, but they put the holes there to make the files smaller so you can fit more of them on your phone or in your computer or whatever. It makes it easier to stream. But down here, this like solid line, this is a continuous variable. This is more like, maybe you really have to go back to like records or tape recordings of things where every little sound is being recorded all the way along the way. And this is like a clock with the second hand or like a millisecond hand where you're able to sort of really cut, you know, you can get down to very finite differences in the variable as you're measuring it. Things like temperature, even, you know, weight, depending on the kind of scale you have. You can get down to 100.2 pounds or 116.56 pounds. You can get further and further more precise by simply just having a more precise way of measuring the variable, right? I can't get more precise with number of children per family, right? I can't, you have 2 kids, you have 3 kids, you have 4 kids, there's no way of getting more precise. It's all whole values. Anyway, so this is, again, analogies. The discrete variables are more like sort of digital music, where this is really more like sort of older analog music, analog sound. So discrete things, even like dichotomous things like male, female, or yes, no, those things are considered sort of discrete. They only take on a couple of values. Anyway, questions about that? Like I've got that up enough. So it's like testing basics, right? A test is any measure, any device or technique used to sort of quantify some behavior or aid in the prediction or understanding of behavior. A psychological test is you're trying to measure any characteristics that pertain to human beings, right? So we oftentimes look at anything can be a psychological test. If a person is responding to it, it's in some way a psychological test in a very broad sense. So educational testing, things like aptitude or achievement, those things are also can be considered psychological tests. You have things like overt, observable activity of the individual. So some tests are not tests that a person takes, but that a person will observe somebody doing something and then they fill out the test. Right? So there's observational tools that people use to sort of score people on different things, and that we can do that with overt sort of behavioral things. We can actually then score them. But things that are more covert, it takes place in individuals, something like, depression or something where you need to actually get their responses to get their sort of internal workings. Those are sort of are testing more sort of covert behaviors as opposed to overt ones. So overts are observable, easy to sort of watch somebody do something and figure out what they're doing, or covert isn't. You have to sort of go inside and sort of really get them to respond in some way to get into what exactly is going on inside of them. All right. So scale. So let me back up a second, because oftentimes the word test and the word scale get used interchangeably a lot, and for the most part that's fine. But the idea is if you give someone a test and it puts them on some continuum of being higher or lower, like like an achievement test or aptitude test, or if you score higher, you're seen as more intelligent or less apt or something. That is putting people onto a scale, actually a higher or lower sort of continuum. It relates raw scores on a test to some defined theoretical or empirical distribution. Like IQ is an empirical distribution, right? We know 100 is the average. It moves at like 15 units. We'll talk more about that later. And this idea of taking a test and creating a scale with it is a method of operationalizing a psychological construct using multiple items like a questionnaire and being able to put someone on a continuum of being more depressed or less depressed, more anxious or less anxious, more or less of things. Be able to actually have a scale where you know if someone's high or low on a particular outcome. It's a way of sort of operationalizing things that way. All right. Now there are individual tests versus group tests. So an individual test is something where a test administrator has a sit with a single person. They go through and score them. They go through and give them things. So like the WAIS, this is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, version 3. I think there's actually a newer version than that, but an individual person has to actually administer the test. So it's a one-on-one, one administrator, one test taker. Same thing with the MMPI-2, has to be administered to a single person. Or a group test, or a single examiner gives a test to a group of people. So things like the SAT and GREs are all done that way. And these are also group norm tests. So how you know if you do better or worse on the GRE is you being compared to other people who took the GRE or other people who took the SAT to see where your ranking is. So you're given a percentile and a score. And it used to be you were given a score and they figured out your percentile from that. Now it's the other way around. They actually figure out where you fall percentile-wise and they convert that to a score. So it's sort of the other way around. But these are sort of more grouped tests where these are actually, again, given to individuals, and you're actually given sort of a certain cutoff value, like with the MMPI, where it looks at the different scales, and you can tell if a person has. You're compared to what they call like a norm set. You have people who respond in a normal range to see if you're sort of above or below that, but it's not the same thing as a group normed test where your score is actually dependent on where you fall within a group of people that actually took it. All right. Again, interrupt questions anytime. I'll just continue to sort of barrel through stuff. If you got questions, let me know. And if you're typing anything into the, I don't see, I got no indication of anything from the chat function. So let me know if someone's writing stuff in there. So with the individual test, oftentimes, like with the WAIS and MMPI, it's a tad bit confusing because even with individual tests, they're often normed, and we'll talk about that on Thursday. They're normed, meaning that they will find people that based on other measures, they have clinical interviews and all kinds of other things are considered normal. I use quotes because they're normal because they're falling at a certain range within it's sort of acceptable on a scale. So what is normal depends on the scale. And then they look at an individual takes, say, the MMPI, and they'll look to see if there's any subscale in the MMPI where someone actually spikes. And the way the MMPI works, this is like a bad rendition of it, but instead of just being one test score, you're actually given, it's like a bunch of tests. Like there's a bunch of subscales. And I don't remember what they're called. Off the top of my head, let's say there's 7 subscales. And you're basically given like a pattern of where you lie on those subscales based on your responses. They'll actually look at those responses and see, okay, well, most people on item 1, this is the sort of norm for that, right? So you're below that, great. But for number 2, normally the cutoff is sort of somewhere here, and you're actually above the cutoff for what is considered normal. So it's whatever 2 is measuring. Let's say 2 is measuring something about depression. Well, you might then be past the clinical cutoff for depression and into a diagnostic level of depression. So even though every person takes it individually and they compare it to a normed sample, it's not a group test, because group tests, your score on, say, the SAT depends on all the other people who took the SAT around the same time. And you actually look to see where you actually are, and they'll give you a score based on, okay, well, you did better than 90% of respondents or 90% of people who took the test. So your score actually falls in at the 90th percentile, and that's actually how they assign you the score on that particular exam. Especially since most of these have moved to the computer adaptive versions, it's even more so that case that they actually do it that way. We can talk more about that later, like computer adaptive. But this is not just a group test because they give it to you as a group, but also because your score depends on the group with which also took the tests around the same time, or the group that you're being sort of compared to. It's not a normed sample, it's just a sample of respondents that are all taking it at the same time. Did I answer your question? That was Yvette. Was it? Yeah. Did that help? Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. Okay. Can somebody read it? I gotta walk away. I gotta walk over there. What was the question? See, that's a good question. So you're thinking, not often enough. Right? And it's not just about that. So there's so many problems with norm-based tests. It all depends on who is normed against. So there's all kinds of tests that for over decades have shown that, like, let's go back to, there was that, I forgot the name of the author, but there was a book called The Bell Curve, where a guy used intelligence tests to make this argument that, I think it was specifically African Americans, but I think they were just saying any ethnic minority, they were intellectually inferior to Caucasians because of how they scored on intelligence tests, right? Well, seeing as how the intelligence tests were normed on middle-aged Caucasians, mostly men, at the time, well, no offense, but no shit, right? Of course they didn't score as well, because that's not who they're normed against. You understand? So norming is a very strange practice, and for a long time, scales were normed on male respondents. Now we're going back some time, like 50s and 60s especially, were normed on male respondents, especially male white respondents. And then it showed that women were more depressed, more this and more that, because they weren't normed as part of the sample. So depending on who you choose as your norm sample, there's a problem. There's an issue already. And then also, these samples can change over time, right? So people can, there can be shifts in what is normal. So there should be a regular sort of renorming of tests that oftentimes doesn't happen. At least it doesn't happen enough. So your question about how often they get renormed depends on the test, but likely there's a lot of tests that are still going off the same norm that they got like in the 70s. Right? And you tell me people responding today are the same as they were back in the 70s on something, it's sort of goofy. So whenever you're using a test, is one of the things you got to keep in mind. All right, if it's a norm test, who was it normed against? There's all kinds of psychometric publications that are coming out showing like bias in the use of this particular scale with this particular subpopulation of people because they don't fit that norm. And actually that's what's creating the bias. So it's not that the people are higher or lower on a thing based on a norm, it's just that the test is biased because of who they chose as the norm sample. Right? So that's what I'm saying, there is some ugly stuff. So not everything about psychometrics is sort of pretty. There's a lot of ugliness that goes on, and so sometimes those things were designed that way. So it's not just accidental. They picked the norm sample to make sure that these subpopulations actually didn't score as high. Right? So there's some evidence of that as well. right? So there's all kinds of super suspicious stuff that has gone on, across the decades in terms of use of testing and all that stuff. So again, I'm a psychometrician by education and by trade experience and stuff. When people start to want to use tests for things, even when it comes to hiring, it's a big one. Let's give people a bunch of personality tests and they'll help us pick, who to hire and who not to hire. And you're going down a super tricky road, because depending on who you're norming those things on and how you're making those decisions, it's almost more than likely going to be discriminatory in some way or another. There's going to be some bias built in. So it's very, very complicated. And I always suggest people don't do it, because it's going to be very, very hard to do without doing it wrong, right? There's like one very difficult, complicated way to do it right, but a million ways to screw it up and do something wrong. All right, that's an excellent question. Okay. You got things like human ability tests. We look at things different ways. Achievement. This really evaluates what an individual has learned. So oftentimes the achievement and aptitude test are used interchangeably, right? There's sort of people use them as if they mean the same thing. They don't, because achievement measures what you know, or an aptitude test measures your capacity for future potential. What is your aptitude? So if you ever wonder, like I remember the first time I took like the pre-SAT or whatever, and I got to the analogy section, I'm like, I don't remember having an analogies course in high school. Why am I being measured on this thing? It's because it wasn't an achievement test. It's an aptitude test, right? It's a way of sort of measuring your aptitude for certain things, even if it wasn't directly taught to you. Because if it was directly taught to you, then you're measuring achievement. Make sense? So most tests in a class, right? They're achievement tests. How much have you retained? How much do you understand the material? Those are achievement tests. Or things like the SATs or those kinds of things are supposed to be aptitude tests, which is where things go wrong. It measures the capacity for future potential, but then when you actually compare it to people's actual future potential, it doesn't actually hold up very well. Okay, that's why people are moving further and further away from wanting to use things like the SATs and GREs. And then you got intelligence tests, which is sort of like a mixture of achievement and aptitude together. It's looking at people's general potential to solve problems. The problem is it does depend a lot on experience. And intelligence tests like the Stanford Binet, when you get this idea of an IQ, it is definitely a normed test, because what you're being normed against is people your age. So when you take an intelligence test, we'll talk about this more later. They basically will measure a bunch of people that are the same age as you, and see how much they know and how much they're able to get correct on the test. And then you take the test. And then they try to see if you know more or less than people your age. If you know more than people your age, then you have a higher than average IQ. If you know less than people your age, you have a lower than average IQ. If you know exactly the same amount as people your age, then you have about a 100 or an average IQ. So it's all based on age. There was a sort of an age norming process that they did with intelligence testing, especially in the beginning. And it's actually not that different now. It's just more mathematically complex. But they look at, with things like the GRE and intelligence tests and those kind of things. They look at things. They look at everyone who sort of responded in a particular time range, and then they look at the range of scores and they start to apply percentiles to it. So if you're in the 90th percentile, they then convert that over to a score that puts you in that rank. When it's not about, you still have to know more than other people. So it is a sort of a grouped test that measures both sort of intelligence and aptitude in some way. All right, questions? I literally just talked so much straight that I ran out of breath. I'm sorry, go ahead. Mm-hmm. So I've been on my department's admissions committee for our it used to be called General Experimental Psychology, but now it's called Psychological Science. It's a master's program in research and stuff. And it's one of those things where we've had students that have scored high on the GRE and then didn't do very well in the courses. And we've had students that were horrible on the GRE and then end up being awesome students and doing very well. My general opinion is that the GRE is taken a little with sort of a little too much weight. It's one thing to have it as an indicator of success, but if you weight everything, so a lot of times what admissions committees will look at is like, oh, if their score on the GRE is low, then they don't even look at the rest of the application. And I don't mean my own department. I mean, I get this general sense that GRE is just like linchpin in people's applications, which seems so strange. They're putting way too much weight. So what we tend to look at is if someone's GREs are low, are there other indicators in their GPA or in their extracurricular things, other reasons to believe that the GREs are not necessarily representative of their ability? If that is low and the GPA is low, and they have a lot of things sort of missing, they're as an entire sort of package don't quite meet up, then that's a different story. But if everything else looks really good, we'll tend to sort of ignore the GRE. Right? So I think people put way too much weight in it, and I think it's been used as a roadblock that people can't get around. People that could have gone to graduate school, could have been successful, they do poorly on the GRE, and then they don't bother even applying. It's a deterrent that I think has been used for far too long. And a lot of places are moving to what they call holistic admissions, which is sort of what I'm talking about, where they look at the whole picture, trying to look at more the entire applicant as opposed to just one aspect like the GRE. But it does, and I can tell you why people do it, and it sounds really awful. But I can tell you sort of why the people are holding on to GREs. If you're a program, this is not us. We're not a huge program that gets hundreds and hundreds of applications or thousands. We'll get maybe 50, 60 applications, and we take like 10, 12 students. But there are other programs where they get thousands of applications. It's really easy to go through and say, well, if you don't meet this certain level of GRE or below, then you're out. And it gets rid of a large portion of applicants without having to do a whole lot of work to really review the rest of their application material. So I think that's why it's used. It's like a quick way of sort of weeding out a bunch of applicants all at one time. That sounds super callous, and I'm overstating it, I'm sure, but I definitely get the impression that that's part of it. It's just a lazy way of sort of reducing the pile of applications you got to go through, and get it down to a small pile that then you start to review the rest of their material. Anyway, that was a long answer for what should have been a simple question, but I hope that it makes sense. And there's a lot of people that agree with me, and there's a lot of people that don't. A lot of people that still like, no, I had to take the GRE, so everyone else had to take GRE too. And it's just a weird way of thinking about it. I took the GRE. I did okay. It wasn't awesome. I did all right when I took it. But I'm a weirdo, and I like taking tests. So like I remember back in the STAR testing or the SBAC testing, and I would look forward to it. Like, yeah, I get to take a test. So I was a weird kid. So the standardized testing and stuff was always something I thought was fun. It was like, it's like a puzzle. So. All right, no problem. Thanks for asking questions. Good. It breaks up the monotony of me just rambling on. So one of the hardest things I have to do when we talk about material is trying to narrow things down. So I will go on tangents and talk about things. So I had to learn to rein myself in and sort of stay on topic. So you'll notice I'll go on tangents sometimes, but sometimes that might be the entertaining part of this whole thing. So there's lots of personality tests. There are these quote unquote objective personality tests, which are supposed to be based on, validity, reliability, and all those things that are based on the testing things we're going to be talking about. Item analyses, reliability, those kinds of things. You get all these projective personality tests that are really more about your ability to project what's going on to you onto these sort of other objects or pictures or things. So you got like the ink blots from the Rorschach test. There's this thing called the TAT, which is the thematic apperception test. which is, by the way, apperception is just it's a cool word. Just like learn it, look it up, throw it out around in parties and stuff. People think you're really cool. Apperception. So it's a very strange word. So thematic apperception test, which is they would show, I'll give you an example in a minute, but they show these sort of vague drawings. And then you're supposed to say, well, what do you think happened leading up to this picture, or this picture in this, this scenario in this show in this picture, and based on what you thought was going on, that was supposed to then reveal all this stuff about your personality, and to help with like diagnosis of all kinds of psychopathological illnesses and things. But they've also been super criticized because they're super subjective and all kinds. It's sort of like people would equate it to like reading tea leaves or some other thing, or like tarot cards or something. That it's not scientific enough. But there has been some work towards sort of showing things like the Rorschach or the thematic apperception test actually is reliable for certain things, but not for every. It wasn't like a fix-all that I think people thought it was going to be in the very beginning. All right. Okay, so questions so far, because I want to go through like a quick history, and there's all kinds of information on here, but again, I don't expect you to remember everything. I just want to give you sort of to set the sort of, the scene for how this stuff would develop and why these things came up. Testing is expensive, right? So to get a bunch of people, have them take a test, do the analyses, so testing is an expensive process. So like ETS, that's a $1 billion industry of sort of creating tests, scoring them, and all kinds of stuff. And the crazy thing is, they figured out a way to get you to participate in them creating tests for free. Actually, you pay them to participate in their studies. It's amazing that they've actually been able to figure this out. I'm like, man, these guys are brilliant, because they're able to figure out a way to get you to pay them to create new items and test you on them, so they can use them on other people. It's like, I sometimes think about that. I'm like, man, ETS is and they got like monopoly. It's not like there's no competition for ETS. It's not like they have, there's nobody else doing that stuff. The SAT, the GRE, all those things are done by them. That's it. Right? It's genius. It's awful, but it's genius at the same time.